Hello, I've just put by before you start to listen to this podcast to say this is a podcast about a hack that almost became hugely significant. We know it's a slightly awkward time to release it, given that there is an ongoing cybersecurity incident that has been all over the news that wasn't an almost. If that's an episode you'd like to listen to, please do let us know. You can always get in touch at info@privacyinternational.org. We've got some ongoing internal conversations, as you can imagine, about responses and, our concerns about the CrowdStrike stuff. But this is a podcast about a different incident. We think it's still really interesting and has a lot of very specific and interesting kind of characteristics. So it's definitely worth a listen. We just wanted to say, yes, it's a slightly awkward time to release it, but nonetheless, we hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to The Technology Pill, a podcast that looks at how technology is reshaping our lives every day and exploring the different ways that governments and companies use tech to increase their power. My name is Gus Hossain, and I'm the Executive Director at Privacy International.
And I'm Caitlin, and I'm PI's Senior Campaigns Officer. Hi. Senior is a hard word to say, apparently.
We're very grateful that Caitlin's joining us from a van on the side of the British countryside, right? Is that what it is?
Yes, I'm in a van on the south coast of Wales, having a lovely time, boiling, slowly alive in a tin can. So please accept my apologies for any really dodgy audio, any cars that you can hear on the road behind the van, any trains that you can hear on the train line behind the road behind the van, and anything else that could be an issue. Yes, I'm all plugged in and we have pretty good Wi-Fi, which I think says something about the modern world, but yes.
And on the question of anything else that could possibly interfere with our sound, we're very happy to have Ed join us today, where he warned us that he's underneath an RAF flight path. So you might occasionally hear the Royal Air Force flying above Ed.
And the US Air Force as well. We've got two.
Don't discriminate when it comes to air forces.
Yes, I shall not.
No, they're incredibly loud, both of them.
So Ed, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Ed Garrity. I am a senior technologist at Privacy International.
And if you recognise Ed's voice, it's because you've heard him recently on our podcast about what actually even is encryption, which I think was when this one comes out 2 podcasts ago. The first of the beginning of our series on encryption.
And the other thing you might recognize about Ed is that Ed is the person whose one-liners I love stealing most. So he may say something, you'll say, oh, Gus has said that before. No. You have to understand that Ed always said it first, and I totally stole from him because Ed helps us understand not just how technology is hard, but also how the world that we have come to rely upon of wires and computers and things that go lights on and off in the night is held together, as he would say, with sticky tape and plaster. Did I capture that right, Ed?
Yeah, I think so. Zip ties. Gaffer
Zip
tapes
ties.
in there.
The gaffer
zip
tapes,
ties.
indeed.
Yeah, I mean, gaffer tape's like the Force. It has a light side, a dark side, and it holds the universe together, right?
Excellent. And that brings us to the topic of this week, which is the fact that we came very close to wide-scale disaster at a cybersecurity level. And Ed is going to help us understand that.
Yes.
Yeah, very, very close.
So a few weeks ago, I feel like people that will already know what this is about because they already know, started kind of getting notifications that something pretty big had happened, and everyone who didn't know had no idea. It was one of those kind of really odd, total, hardcore 50-50 splits down the line. Like the people that knew, and suddenly all the kind of group chats were massively popping off, and then everyone else was like, no, something's happening. I have no idea what you're talking about. And my partner's one of the people that knew, and so he was like on his phone, group chats popping off, notifications going, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. And I was kind of sitting him next to him like, all my social media is fine. I don't know what you're talking about. And so from someone who was on the other side of that line, which is Ed, to kind of me and presumably a good percentage of our listeners, we're kind of trying to work out what was that and how big of a deal was it. And so I guess I've written down the first question as what did you know morning of, but actually I think we should probably skip ahead to what is it that I'm talking about? Do you want to explain?
Sure. So one of the few things that we know in tech, unfortunately, is that there are always really big disclosures on kind of national holidays, Western national holidays, Christmas, New Year, it always. So there's me. We've got a long weekend. It's Good Friday, Easter. I'm doom scrolling because, what else are you supposed to do when you've got a day off work? And suddenly up pops on my Twitter feed. There's just this one tweet that says, there's a backdoor in XZ utilities. Please upgrade immediately. What? Really strange. It just kind of on its own, just out of nowhere. There was no real context other than a link to the actual disclosure. So XZ utilities is a compression algorithm, right? Anybody who's used 7Z, 7-zip is like the original version, and then XZ is kind of version 2. It's been around for about sort of 20, 25 years now. And what it's really, really, really good at is compression. It's really, really good at taking big files and making them really small. It has what's called a large compression ratio. Another thing that it can do is it can do this compression really well, but at the same speed or slightly quicker, or maybe even slightly slower, but around the same sort of speed as the big ones that everybody uses that have been used, everywhere for the last kind of 40 years. So this is a compression algorithm, just like Zip or RAR or 7Z or any of these. And I'm going, hang on, how can there be a backdoor in a compression algorithm? And there was a link just to the disclosure. And yeah, it was a journey, shall we say.
And so from my perspective, I was in one of these group chats that Caitlin was referring to, where it was Ed and a few other tech-minded people at PI. And I see this message saying, okay, there's something going on with XZ. I didn't know what XZ was. I now know, thanks to Ed. And then there was a lot of talk about Linux. And then there was a lot of talk about specific aspects of the code. But the thing that made it all come together for me, which is, as ever, that Ed does, he shared an XKCD comic that showed basically how modern code exists, or how modern systems exist, which is there are all these fancy things built with blocks upon blocks upon blocks, but underneath all of that, there's always one little block that if removed, or that if it disintegrates, the whole system comes crashing down. And Ed was basically saying, that's what we've just discovered. So tell us, this affected who and what was it?
So this was effectively our first kind of in the wild supply chain attack on open source software that was caught. Thankfully, it was caught just before it managed to get out and have a massive splash. But this was aimed at two specific families of Linux distributions, two Linux flavors, if you like, which was Red Hat and Debian and their derivatives. And these are used on servers all over the world. It's kind of everywhere. Raspberry Pis, for instance, tend to run Debian. Lots of embedded systems will be running probably a Debian version as well.
I think we have the number here in our notes, right, Caitlin?
Yeah, 96.4% of the top 1 million web servers operating systems are Linux-based. What that means in terms of Red Hat and Debian, I don't know. But when you first got there's a backdoor in XE, did you initially think that's weird, but it wasn't, oh damn, the internet is at risk?
Well, it was one of those moments of what on earth am I looking at? Like it was so kind of out of left field that just it dropped out of nowhere. There was no context on this. And reading the report where this attack, which we're going to talk about later on, the actual attack itself was done over a series of years. And the fact that it was kind of discovered by accident at the end by one person who managed to just tear the whole thing down in an email that was sent out to a mailing list. It was jaw-dropping. It was honestly just like, it was a whodunit. I was watching it in real time on Easter, and they're all kind of tearing this thing apart, going, where's all this code from, and what does this do? And it was fascinating to watch. And I think probably is the first real example of a big supply chain attack like this, because XZ being so good at compression means it's everywhere. It's shipped by default on a lot of operating systems because it's so good at doing what it does. So yeah, had this managed to get any further into the upstream, had it not been caught, this would have been just, shattering the internet.
I want to get to how it got implemented because that's a fascinating bit, but let's just talk about what could have been done with this. Is it you can cause something to crash, you can actually run code, you can own the whole system? What is it?
All of the above.
Oh, Jesus.
So it was remote code execution in SSH. So we de facto use a secure shell to try and remotely administer machines. Layers of encryption, it's very good. It's de facto standard everywhere. What this backdoor in XZ did was it took advantage of the fact that this secure shell is able to communicate with other things on the machine. And so it basically hooked its way in. And if it was presented with, if you think back to my public-private key podcast I did a few episodes ago, if it's presented with a specific public key from whoever this attacker was, we don't know, would then execute whatever code was then in the second half of the public key. And this was done in such a way as it wasn't logged. There was no need for authentication because your secure shell is running as a system process. So effectively, it would have been remote code execution on any secure shell enabled Debian or Red Hat machine on the public internet.
And none the wiser as to the fact that it's happened. It doesn't leave anything bruised because it's actually using the security protocol in order to undertake the attack.
Yeah. What it does is when it's checking the key, so every time a communication happens, so this could be sending a character across when we're typing to send remote commands or even a refresh, the key, part of your public key, is sent with it. And so what it would do is part of the authentication code effectively short-circuited out into some malicious code shipped with XZ that then said, hey, is this from our command and control? Yes, let's run whatever code's in the second half of this key.
Wow.
So there's no logging involved. This is all just done in the background.
Extraordinary.
And that was aimed at the vast majority of web servers that exist. And by vast, I mean almost all.
Debian and Red Hat are kind of de facto standard out there. And because they're de facto standard, there are also a lot of distributions based on them. So that's why I saw on Kali Linux, which is what's called a rolling distribution. It's very, very bleeding edge, very up to date, comes from the latest of the latest of the latest in Debian. And that was why they were caught in it, because other distributions hadn't actually got to the stage of mainstreaming it yet.
Wow.
I don't think many people understand how the code that runs the world is manufactured or is done. We imagine, there are, these beautiful campuses in Silicon Valley full of, people with PhDs from august institutions sitting down, writing the code that runs the train systems and the websites and the banking systems of the world. When in reality, when we're talking about Linux and open source systems, much of it is built by people who don't know each other from different parts of the world using commit and pull requests to a server, often GitHub, where somebody has to start a project, and I guess XZ was a project. Somebody has to maintain that project, and then people from all around the world can say, hey, can this be changed, or can this be added? And then together people collaborate and commit and update these systems. And this is how the whole open source world operates. And it has functioned pretty darn well, considering all the tech that we have out there and available to people across the world that is free to use and free to audit. Yet somehow somebody gamed this system with a social engineering attack, essentially. Does that capture how this world works?
I think so. You've got kind of different contributors to open source. You've got the people who are actually being paid to do it. It's a bit of a fallacy these days that just because the source is free and open and under expressive licenses and whatever, that the people who are doing it aren't being paid. For instance, this attack was actually discovered by somebody who was being paid at Microsoft to do basically auditing on an open source third-party project that wasn't XZ. It was Postgres, a databasing server.
Oh, that's really funny. I remembered being at the Redmond campus back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when Microsoft had announced how they were so pissed at these open source systems competing with Windows. But not only were they competing with Windows, but some of their own engineers were using their time to build it and using what Microsoft claimed was their own code in these so-called open source systems. But that's just the way the world works. And it's interesting that it is Microsoft ultimately that had a role. Well, somebody at Microsoft had a role to play in identifying this.
Absolutely. So the idea is you do have teams who are paid to do development, but you also have people like me who are... I guess I'm an anger-driven developer. I see stuff that annoys me, and then I go in and fix it. And it generally takes me a long time. I'm one of these 10 times engineers that everybody talks about, right? Everything that I do takes me 10 times what it should do, and I break things 10 times as much as anyone else would break it. But I tend to kind of get there in the end.
But that's also why we have somebody who's in control of the project who receives these requests, reviews them, and then approves them.
Yeah. So effectively, you generally have a hierarchy of people. You've got your owners, your code owners. Those are the ones who have absolute, complete, full control. They are the ones who generally they'd have been the initial developers, perhaps, or they've been assigned the project if it's a bigger project. You then also have maintainers. Their jobs generally do things like porting or allowing code to be used across different systems. So, for instance, one of the projects I worked on, I was a maintainer for the Windows code base, which meant that I would fix Windows-specific things that were broken. And then we had a Mac OS maintainer whose job was to fix the Mac OS-specific stuff. But the code owner who sat on top owned the whole project, and everything which we would commit, everything which we would change, we then present to the code owner or one of the maintainers or whoever it is, depending on where you are in the hierarchy. And you present it to them as a patch. And this patch is human readable and it's computer readable. And it's supposed to be a series of small atomic changes with an explanation against each of what you've done and why. What's then supposed to happen is the code owners, the maintainers, whoever kind of further up the chain will leave comments against your code. They might suggest, hey, have you thought about using this inbuilt function you didn't know existed? Or, this is rubbish, what you're doing, throw it away. But eventually they will work with you to try and get that code in the upstream because effectively they're kind of getting it for free. I mean, this is one of was it Zuckerberg who said something about him open sourcing his Llama project if he just got it 10% better by free things it paid for itself. So there are kind of two different things. So you get people who come along and say, this is broken. So you put an issue or a bug request or whatever. You get people who come along and say, I think you need a new button here, or have you thought about, like with XZ, why in the days of I've got 24 threads in my machine, you're only using one of them to do compression, those sorts of things. And then you might get someone else come along and implement the code. But what happens is, because generally these teams are remote, as you say, many of them probably haven't met each other, especially if it's a proper open source project where there isn't actually anybody being paid. It ends up being a web of trust like it was originally. And this was, as you say, this is just a social engineering attack on that web of trust. Somebody or a group of somebodies spent 2 years embedding themselves in this web of trust, taking active part in conversations as a maintainer. There were people who they were submitting translations, being really forthcoming on the email mailing lists and things like that. It's a con game. It was all social engineering.
So, how did it get there?
Okay, so let's rewind back to October 2021. So we're going back now about 3.5 years from when the attack was actually discovered.
I mean, to get the mood, the vibe, it's like the pandemic's been on a while, but it's still kind of up and down. You're still kind of hooked into pandemic news, but you're probably no longer locked down. Is that about the right kind of era of time?
I guess it probably is.
And Kabul just fallen, because in August 2021 was when Kabul fell.
Blimey.
Oh, wow.
Taliban's back in power. Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing what's happened just in a short amount of time, isn't it? So, back in October 2021, this GitHub account, people, who knows? I'm going to refer to them as a he because they used the male name Jia Tan. It's more likely a group of people, could be female, more likely a group of people, to be honest. But I'll just stick with he for simplicity because otherwise I'll get confusing. So, Jia Tan appears out of nowhere and sends a patch, a very just innocuous patch. And then fast forward about a month, he sends another innocuous patch and becomes effectively kind of a maintainer, starts to push more and more patches. So we get to February of 2022. And at this point, he's being credited as an author for pushing patches, and he's getting more and more commits getting pushed up. Then it comes to April of 2022, and another third party comes along, a person called Jigar Kumar, or the name Jigar Kumar, comes along and starts complaining that patches are taking too long to be merged into the upstream XZ corpus, into the code base. At the same time, we then have another third party, a guy calling himself Dennis Enns, comes along and says, hey, is XZ being maintained? XZ for Java, is this being maintained? Because it doesn't look to me like any patches are being pulled. Nothing's really happening. So at this point, bear in mind, of course, that there have already been several commits been pulled up by this, but there are now these 2, 3, 4 different voices coming along saying, hey, we want more patches pulled, more patches pulled. They're pushing on the pressure. Lasser pushes back. So at this point, we're in June of 2022. Lasser has been maintaining this code base on his own for 25 years, roughly. Unfortunately, Lasser also suffers with mental health problems and basically was approaching burnout, takes regular time off from his projects. So the result of all these people coming along and pushing the pressure on this guy, on Lasser, the one maintainer for 25 years, the guy who wrote the original code, and saying, hey, you're actually killing your project. You're not putting the energy in. You're killing your project here, was that he started to take more and more commits from people who started to show interest, which is great. Fast forward, and Jia Tan has actually become a full-on maintainer. He now is in full control of the code base. He starts to do a few things that look a little bit interesting. He starts to change the bug report email to be, instead of being an email address that goes directly to the original maintainer, goes to an email address that goes to both of them. So he's now being also informed of any bugs that come from the project. He then starts to build releases on his own and push out his own releases. He's now in full control. He goes to OSS Fuzz, which is a big open source. It's a Google open source project. The idea of a fuzzer is to throw as many bits of random crap at a program as you can to see how it handles it. And if you break it, you can get interesting things that happen out the other end, right? So if you throw in a string in a certain way, you might get buffer overflows, which then you can lead to a full-scale attack. So this is effectively an automated way of throwing crap at code to see if you can break it. That's what it's for. G is very good because he notices that actually it's starting to throw errors on some of the code that he's pushing up. So he goes upstream to Google, to OSS Fuzz, and say, hey, I think in my project there's actually a false positive here, and starts working with them and switches off OSS Fuzz detection in his code. Then there's another third party who comes along. I'd forgotten about this one. Hans Jensen. Hans Jensen comes along out of nowhere. Now we're in 2023. And he goes, hey, here's a couple of patches I've written. And these patches are effectively the ones which allowed XZ to go on to do the damage that it did. What these patches did, and they may have been innocuous, they may have been committed in complete earnest by the person who committed them, but it looks like it was a person who appeared, committed this, and then disappeared again, never to be seen. What this code did was this implemented the ability for functions to be called between XZ and other programs. This is the thing that it actually used to do the patching in the calls in Secure Shell. So this was, of course, put in by a completely third party, right? This wasn't put in by Jiatan, of course. This gets merged upstream. At this point, Jiatan moves the website for XZ from one which was controlled by Lasser under the original project to redirect to a GitHub Pages page. So it means that he's not only in control of the code base, but he's also in control of what is displayed to the user when they go to the XZ website, because he has no control over Lasser's infrastructure, but he does on GitHub. Now, we're in February 2024. He's set all of this work. He's managed to weasel his way in. They've played the long con game, the pressure, you're killing your project, you have to get someone else on board. 2 years later, he's been pushing in great bits of code. He's been bringing in loads of functionality. He's brought in multi-threading of compression and all these things. February of 2024 is when he decides to launch his attack. And what is fascinating about this is that, one, it's done based on knowledge of the kind of development and deployment ecosystem and relies on that, which I'll talk about in a second. But the other one is that he is having to deploy the attack files of the payload in the open because he needs everybody to have access to it. So this is where it becomes really fascinating, right? So we've got the payload is sitting in these test files. And he actually says when he uploads the test files that the first one is a broken archive, which the first part says hello, the middle part is broken, and then the end says world. And he says on the commit, this was written by hand. This is to test how it deals with broken archives. The problem is, of course, that starts to fire bugs. He's pushed a few bugs in with his code. And once you've written a test that's supposed to produce one result, and it's supposed to be a broken archive, how do you then go ahead and kind of go, I need to replace this broken archive with another broken archive? What he did was he said, I generated it on my local machine using a random, whereas now I've generated this with a set random that I know what it is and we can reproduce these zips in future. It's very clever, very clever. It's a con game. It's all a con game. Then, at around this time, Lasser Collins has come back in and he's starting to commit some of his own code. He's got a bit of oomph back in. And one of the things he commits is a sandbox. So effectively, it checks when it's compiling, when it's building, whether the Linux machine that it's on has certain security features that it can enable. He pushes this code up. Jiatan comes along, looks at the code, goes, oh, let me just edit some things. And what he actually does is he breaks the code. He deliberately breaks it. And what that does is it means that the check to see whether your computer has the security features, the entire point of this code, it fails. So it doesn't matter whether your computer has the security features or not, the check code itself is broken, so it fails. And he managed to push this up in plain sight, and nobody noticed.
So you got us to February 2024. How did it all start to really come together and fall apart?
Yeah. So this backdoor relied on the ability for XZ and OpenSSH to be able to talk to other things. Actually, it relied on OpenSSH to be able to talk to other things through ifuncs, remote functions, remote function calls. The 29th of February unbeknownst to Giatan and the group, whoever they are, a third-party developer comes along and sends a pull request saying, hey, I don't think our SSH client should be doing this, or our SSH server should be doing this. I think we should patch this behavior out. So we've now got a race on between the people who are maintaining the thing that basically enables this backdoor to work and the backdoor manufacturers, producers, whatever, themselves, trying desperately to push it into the distributions before the patch comes out. Because if they can get it into the distributions before the patch comes out, they have a likelihood of it actually getting some sort of penetration in the market. But of course, now they're under pressure because they've got this active patch being loomed over them. And they start to get a little bit pushy, and they start to make mistakes, and they start to basically raise red flags enough that there were enough eyes on them that it all just kind of came crashing down in the end.
Wow. So somebody noticed that something was wrong, and so therefore was going to recommend a patch eventually. And the adversaries, the baddies in this situation, needed to get this out into the wild world before that patch became available. And that gap between the bad code being out there and the patch descending to fix the bad code was that key moment, that key window of opportunity for them to exploit this in the wild.
Yeah. And can you imagine, you've just spent 2 years building this, and somebody, some third party, completely unknown to them, has just blown it all up.
That blows my mind. If this is the movie you're watching and the actor playing the baddie is like an actor you like, you're rooting for him and thinking, who the hell is this person coming out of the blue with this patch? What, how, why?
Yeah. And it was serendipity that it just so happened that this patch was being landed upstream to stop the behavior in the secure shell, which allowed this backdoor to happen in the first place.
I see. So it wasn't even related.
Right. So, of course, then that puts pressure on Giatan, and they then have to start pushing stuff out pretty quickly. So one of the test files which he uploaded was broken, and he needed to regenerate this test file because it wasn't actually working and was causing all sorts of errors. And actually, it was one of the things that was put in this version 2 of the code was not just 1, but I think 5 checks to see if it was running on Linux or not before it would actually build, because he hadn't done that check. So it was firing on all sorts of machines that it shouldn't have been firing on. What's also interesting is it was aimed specifically at Red Hat and Debian and their derivatives, but it was causing errors in other Linux distributions. So Gentoo, for instance, started getting all sorts of errors based on this backdoor code, even though they weren't targeted, and the code wouldn't execute on their system. They were still getting errors, and they actually worked with Giatan to try and remove these errors and patch them out.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Because this is how the community works. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he fixes Giatan. We're now in March. Giatan actually then pushes up 2 bug fixes that he's worked on with Gentoo. And these actually look to be real bugs to stop this from being fired on Gentoo where it shouldn't have been fired. And then he has to push out the updated backdoor fixes. But what's interesting about that to me is that of the code which he pointed to, which he said, this is the fix, this code here is the fix, was basically good enough to shut up the people who were looking in. It looked good enough, but actually didn't do anything. It was changing some spacing, and it set a variable which then wasn't used anywhere else. He used that as cover to then sneak up his fixed tests, the test files, and then went back to the Gentoo guys and went, hey, I fixed it. And they looked at the fix and went, yeah, okay, that's good enough. But this isn't the only time he relied on basically obfuscating things enough that a kind of interested enough programmer looking over it will go, yeah, that looks okay, that looks sane.
Yeah.
Because what he didn't do was he didn't put the dropper in the source code which was available and open on GitHub.
What's a dropper?
So the thing which actually did the attack, the thing which actually built the attack and ran the nasty code in the test files. That didn't actually exist in the source code as was published on GitHub. What this relied on was the fact that maintainers have to have different build properties and different sets of patches for different operating systems and different distributions. And what happens is these are released as a thing called the tarball. It's an archive which is produced by the upstream project, which is then taken by the maintainers of the Debian or Red Hat or whatever, but with upstreamed fixes specifically for that platform. And what he'd done was he'd hidden it in one of the config files in there in such a way as it looked like it was doing a series of checks to see what was going on the machine to enable security or, and actually what it was doing was decrypting this this broken archive and then running the code inside it that then decrypted a second supposedly working archive, which was actually two files stuck together, and executed the second half of that. But what he realized from having pushed up the broken tests and having to fix them was he needed an extension mechanism. So he pushed that in as well. And it actually has a test to see within the code when it builds on Debian or Red Hat. Within the code, it checks if there were any more test files that had a specific magic string within them. And if it did, then it would just load them in as an extension. So this was an extensible backdoor. They were hoping this would be around for a while.
And so you know all this, and anybody who's interested could tell the exact same story you're telling, because this is all done in the open. This is all done on these commits and these push requests and pull requests. It's all visible and logged essentially on GitHub, which is freely available to anybody who wants to have a look. And so you can see these usernames of this person on this date requested this person on that date committed that. And so you're able to disentangle step by step what contributed to the very moment of when all of a sudden you had the tarball, you had the keys in the right spots, and then it was all ready to go, essentially.
Yeah. And it was not just ready to go, it was going. What they started to do, Geotan, people around Geotan as well, start to do another thing, which is actually, again, a pretty normal open source behavior, which is there are people who will go around. In fact, there are bots. I run them against my own projects. There are bots which will look for outdated dependencies, and they will say, hey, there's a new version of this thing. We need you to update it.
Oh, clever. So they're even getting people to say, we need this.
Yeah. So there's been an updated version. There's been a new version of the code which has been pushed out. And so he goes to the maintainers and says, hey, before you push out your next version of whatever operating system it is you're running on, can you actually update to it's effectively the backdoor version? I say what's effectively, what is the backdoor version? So this was the fight to try and get it in the upstream distributions before they brought the patch in against it.
And so how did this get caught?
This got caught by one guy at Microsoft who was being paid to try and debug Postgres, which is a big distributed databasing server, which we actually use at PI for a couple of our things. But part of what he was doing was he was doing benchmarking, and he needed to remove system noise. Basically, he needed to work out what was noise coming from like the background processes in the computer and what was kind of load being run through his testing.
Okay.
So what this required was a few different things to be in the right place at the right time. Because we'd had Geotan and others going to the upstream maintainers of these operating systems, it actually managed to make its way into Debian SID. So for those who don't know, which is probably most people, Debian is actually, the releases are based after characters in Toy Story.
Oh, yes, that's right. Sid. Oh, I love Sid. Sid's the slinky dog, right?
No. Sid is the kid who destroys all the toys.
Sid's the mean kid. That's right. He puts
he's
a rocket.
Not actually mean. He doesn't know the toys are real. He doesn't know they have thoughts, feelings, and emotions. He's just a kid playing with toys. In the context of the movie, he's a mean kid. In the context of if he was a real person with a real life, he wouldn't be a mean kid necessarily. I don't know why I decided to pile in on that one.
Did you used to like microscope to your toys or something?
I did chew the heads off my
I
Barbie
admit-
dolls.
Yeah.
That is something I did do.
Okay, well, moving swiftly on.
They were just a very good material. They're like a very nice sensory material. But yeah, if they were real, then I committed war crimes, frankly.
Anyway,
This is a Make Them podcast.
yeah. Oh, I love this. So yeah, Sid's the kid who destroys all the toys, and Sid is Debian unstable. It is, you expect things to be broken, or you expect things to break. Bleeding edge. It's as close to bleeding edge as you can get. What happens is it goes through unstable, and then if it's something like 3 weeks without any bugs, then it manages to get into testing, and then if it's in testing for I think 3 or 5 weeks, then it goes into whatever the point release is. So Debian Sid uses brand new, up-to-date, latest versions of things. So it was using the up-to-date bleeding edge backdoored version of XZ. And because he happened to be doing micro benchmarking, and I do mean micro benchmarking, we're talking milliseconds here, he discovered that when he was running his battery of tests, part of which was to do secure shell SSH logins, but they were supposed to all fail, so they were supposed to stop instantaneously. He discovered that it was actually using 100% of his processor. And he's going, what's going on here? This isn't supposed to happen. And it's just because he happened to be looking. And then what he discovered was that actually the SSH logins were taking about twice as long as they should do. But again, we're talking milliseconds here.
So you had to be watching at the milliseconds and microseconds level to even notice that this was happening. And this Microsoft guy was doing that because that's specifically what he was trying to achieve.
Yeah. He happened to be in the right place at the right time, running the right code.
Wow.
And doing the right tests and having enough kind of interest to follow what was going on here, because he could have just gone, it's in a third party, who cares? But he decided actually to go down that kind of rabbit hole and see where it led. And where it led was an email to the mailing list saying, I originally thought this was backdoored in Debian, but actually it's the project itself. All the wheels came off at this point because it was blown out in the open.
So he wrote an email saying, something's not right here.
He said it's backdoored.
He went as far immediately to say it's backdoor. We recognized what was happening.
Yeah, he managed to work out enough of the code to work out the decorruption, uncorruption thing. So he could work out what each step was doing. And because these were quite simple, they're elegant. It's a very elegant solution, but it was using simple inbuilt basic BusyBox tools. Like, this was very clever use of tools that are used day to day by programmers to do things. And he managed to chain them in such a way as to build this obfuscation in. But because they're all like command line tools that we use as sysadmins fairly regularly, it was able to then be run in reverse to work out what it was.
So the very virtues of the system, the practice that allowed this to happen, being open source, is what allowed us to identify what had happened and disentangle it all.
Although he didn't require access to the source.
Oh, that's interesting.
Having access to the source helped. But the errors which were causing the CPU to be pegged at 100%, that wasn't because of the source code. He saw that there was something weird happening there from the outset. If that had been closed source, he would have put a bug report up with them, and then it would have been looked at internally. Maybe it might have been caught, maybe it might not have. But, he was using debugging tools within Linux to look at what had happened. So I don't think the source, the fact that the source code was there meant that we could see exactly what it was doing. But I think it would have been reverse engineered pretty quickly. And my impression is it would have been found whether this was closed source or not, because it was the binaries that were displaying the behavior.
Interesting. And so now we have this announcement. I think this is a backdoor. And it's Easter weekend in the UK. You start seeing this and you're able to go and have a look at what's happening. Everybody's starting to look at how did this come about? And now we have this picture emerging that there's this individual who basically rose within this project and was able to do it, a number of things. But I got the impression as well that everybody who was putting pressure on the project, that could have all just been that one person as well, right?
I have very little doubt in my mind that they were related. Very little doubt. There was just too many things happened at once, and the responses. So, reading through the responses to some of the pressure which was put on him, and he's saying, "Look, I've not abandoned the project, but actually, I suffer with my health, and I'm not very well at the minute." The responses back were basically, "Well, sucks to be you. Stop killing your project."
Wow.
So, like, the pressure which was put was very real in that sense, and they were effectively abusing the fact that this was somebody with ill health who they could just push into a corner. Thankfully, he doesn't seem to have been blamed by anybody. I've not seen any negative press about the original maintainer. I think he could have happened to anybody, frankly. Yeah. The attack against him was... I don't want to say sophisticated, because it wasn't a sophisticated attack in that sense, but it was a relentless attack over a period of a couple of years. And it relied on, softly, catchy monkey kind of thing. It was gentle building, to then be the rock when everybody else comes along and goes, "You're killing your project of 25 years. You're a bad person." Yeah. They could then be there to say, "It's okay, I can take the load." Yeah. And it was calculated. It must have been calculated.
It's quite cruel. It's quite a cruel attack to go after one person fairly relentlessly for 2 years, and to go after the project they've worked on in their own time, kind of out of their own interest, out of their own, I wasn't going to say, not quite the goodness of their heart, but the project they've been working on and put a lot of time and resource and effort into over 25 years. They clearly attacked it because it is good and because it is everywhere. There was not structural reasons, but it was specific to that software. And so clearly the intention wasn't personal. But if you're that guy, that's an incredibly personal attack on 25 years of work, and an incredibly personal attack to happen to you over 2 years of someone slowly ingratiating themselves into you, and then other people coming along and personally attacking your commitment and work that you've been spending 25 years on. I think regardless of any particular mental health kind of concerns or things that he was struggling with, it's hard to imagine anyone, being able to withstand that for 2 years. And it's extraordinary.
Absolutely extraordinary. As elegant as the technological attack was, and I use elegance in the kind of most honest sense, earnest sense, if you like. This attack really, wasn't technological. It could have been another project. It just so happens that I think they found the right one. And I think they managed to find a project which had, I don't want to say atrophied, but it had got to the stage where someone coming along and saying, "Yo, I actually want to actively maintain this project for you, or I want to help you with this project," would be then taken on board. And you have, as you say, it's been 2 years actually helping you on your project, and you've been talking with them. I mean, we know he wrote a blog about it, and indeed from the mailing list, we know they were talking off list. I know from some of everyone on this call knows I've been adjacent or in several open source projects over the years, and I can say some of the ones I've become quite close with the maintainers and the developers, even though we've never met, and we're geographically very dispersed. I was best man for a guy that I'd only known via IRC for 12 years, a lot of these relationships are built remotely like that, and to build a relationship like that to then effectively pull the rug from under them to attack them like this is very cruel.
And so, of course, everybody wants to know who perpetrated this attack. What was it going to be used for in their minds? What do we know, or what are we guessing, or what can ever be known about something like this?
So we start with the name. Jiatan is obviously a Chinese name, but there is also a couple of commits with a middle name of Chung, and I don't speak Chinese, but there are discussions between Cantonese and Mandarin speakers basically saying the names as they're put on these commits would not be put together like this. So this is a name that sounds Chinese rather than being a Chinese name. Like if the name Jia Tan was spelt like that, Chung wouldn't be spelt in that way because it's from a different dialect. But then could that be deliberate? There are several what could be slip-ups in time zones where there are two commits where the time zones are Eastern Europe and the rest are all from kind of Philippines. And then you've got the question of the patterns of their commits. So as well as kind of what, you also see when. So you can see that this was committed at, 4:00 in the morning, GMT, UTC, whatever. And you can look at these time periods and you can say, oh, look, somebody's working between these hours and these hours. But of course, that either matches somebody who's working 9 to 5 on one side of the world or somebody who's working like 6 till midnight, so that's also not useful. The names which were being used everywhere, so you've got Jiatan as a Chinese name, and then you've got Jiga Kumar coming along, you've got several Scandinavian names coming along. I don't know that we'll ever find out. Jiatan was a persona which only exists in one other place, which is Twitter, with one like, which is not, and there's no other presence. And it would look to me as though this was a persona built specifically for this purpose, and it was running via a VPN. Like all of the commits were done via a VPN. Is this the work of one or two individuals? It could be. There's nothing it's elegant. It's not outrageously difficult, I guess. They piped a lot of things together in a very elegant way to fix the problem. Could it be a couple of people? Well, maybe, but would you be able to sit on it for 2 years like that if you're effectively not being paid?
That's the thing. Yeah. You're playing such a long game. Extraordinary. Over an Easter weekend, a whole 2-year-long hack or an attempt to compromise an operating system that is used on millions of systems across the world all came crashing down, and we followed it from Ed sending messages around of the latest bit of the analysis, and the world was saved from what we don't know. That's the thing.
Yeah. How many more of these are there?
But this is what I love this story because it captures both the fragility and the beauty of what's going on in today's world. Most people don't understand how fragile our systems are, but most people also don't understand how it takes the hard work of individuals across the world to build the systems to a reliability that we all depend on. And I love that in this story that there's also this patch coming down that's totally independent that was going to stop this from happening. And the attackers needed to get this in. I love this world. I love that the world that you're giving us some insight into how it works by very delicately taking us through this so-called bunch of individuals who are trying to perpetrate, as you say, this elegant attack. Ed, thank you so much for this. We really appreciate that.
Thank you very much for having me on. I enjoy talking about this stuff.
Thanks for listening. Remember, you can sign up to be the first to learn more about our work at pvcy.org/podsignup. And we'll include some links to relevant articles and information in the description wherever you're listening or on our website at pvcy.org/techpill. And we'll include that wonderful comic that Ed shared with us as we were trying to make sense as to what was going on over that Easter weekend. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you use. Music courtesy of Sepia. This podcast was produced by Max Burnell for Privacy International.